Terminal Services Part 2. In this nugget, we'll take a look at terminal services, and this will be part 2. We'll configure our terminal services configuration with tools that we've seen in administrative tools. This will be things such as terminal services configuration and terminal services management. And we'll also take a look at how to configure those options, because there are several options that are available that are repeated in many places. We need to know which ones have priority if there are any two that are in conflict. We'll also take a look at how to install the client. There's a shared folder on the server, and this allows you to install Terminal Services Client, which is the remote desktop connection client piece, on any of your clients. We'll take a look at how to do remote control. You have to actually do that through within a Terminal Services session. So we'll take a look at how to make that happen, and also how to get out of it, because it can be kind of baffling to get out of there if you don't use the right keyboard commands. We'll also take a look at command line utilities, which are very useful, especially in maintaining a server, and especially when you have to perhaps get people off of the server and kind of trickle out your connections. We'll also look at the session directory. This really helps us to make sure that our connections are straightened out with multiple servers in a terminal services cluster. We've got to make sure that when a user reconnects, they connect to the right server. That's what the session directory does for us. We'll also look finally at the licensing issues with terminal server and how to install terminal services licensing. Now, on a terminal server, you do have some administrative tools that will allow you to help configure terminal services according to what your needs are. You can go down here on Administrative Tools to Terminal Services Configuration, which is where we're going to take a look at some server settings. Now, let me quickly address these because they kind of explain themselves. Delete temporary folders on exit will simply help to save on disk space and getting rid of files that probably aren't necessary anyway. Use temporary folders per session, which is also enabled by default, as is the top setting there, will allow each individual user logon to have its own temporary folder. Otherwise, if you set no to this, then everybody has a common shared temporary folders location. Licensing is per device. You can check with Microsoft to see what's more economical, but you might also consider a per user licensing scheme if that's better for you. And we'll talk more about licensing later on. Active Desktop is disabled by default because it requires more network bandwidth. If you can afford the network bandwidth and it won't negatively affect you that way, you can turn that on if you want. Permission compatibility is full security right now. This was the setting that we configured terminal services on when we first installed it. If you find that you have applications that are not compatible with full security, you can just double-click on this item, go back to relaxed security, and give yourself better access to certain file and registry locations. And you can restrict each user to one session. That also helps to avoid that situation where a user is unexpectedly dropped from a connection, and when they reconnect, they establish a second active session instead of being able to resume the first session. And then the session directory is a certain technology that will help to make sure that within a cluster we reconnect to the server where we have an ongoing disconnected session rather than starting a second session. We'll talk about this a little bit more as well. Now then we also have under connections here the RDP TCP properties, and you simply right-click and choose properties to access these. The first thing to see here on the general tab is the encryption level, and by the way, many of these settings are also duplicated in several other places we've already looked at, so I'm not going to repeat anything we've already seen. In any case, the encryption level is by default at client compatible. That's useful if you have other client terminal services clients that you're using besides the remote desktop client, which is capable of 140-bit FIPS encryption. If you're using an older client that's not capable of that level of encryption, then you might need to go to this client-compatible setting for compatibility purposes. You can also go to low, which is only 56-bit encryption, and it encrypts data only from the client to the server, so it's going to protect things like the username and password. You could go to high, which is 128-bit encryption, and it's bidirectional between server and client. There's also FIPS compliant, which is the Federal Information Processing Standard. It's 140-bit bidirectional encryption, and the current client that we have, remote desktop client, is capable of this level of encryption. Now, really, the only reason why I wouldn't want to go to high level of encryptions are really twofold. Number one, I have older clients that cannot support that, in which case perhaps this client-compatible setting would be better. The other reason would be the higher the level of encryption and the more difficult the level of encryption, the more resources are required in terms of processor utilization. And if you can't afford the processor utilization and it's bogging you down too much, you might have to back off the encryption a little bit. It's a little bit of a trade-off. It'll have to be up to your judgment and your security requirements. Now, the only other thing really of note here is the network adapter and one of the settings on the client settings. With the network adapter, by default, all adapters will be able to use RDP connections, in other words, terminal services. You can also install additional adapters. I've only got one. But if I had additional adapters here, I could pick one of them out to be dedicated to RDP traffic. And then one strategy there is to set up another network adapter that's connected to another part of your network for other purposes, such as connection to my mail server, to my database. That way, when my user is connected through the first network adapter that allows terminal services connections, request data from the database, well, they have another network adapter on that terminal server that's dedicated to throughput to that database. Therefore, I get pretty efficient traffic through both of them, and I don't have to use one network adapter to share both kinds of traffic. And I can also make the connections unlimited, at least up to the point that my network productivity can handle it, as well as the server capabilities. And then I can also choose maximum connections to a certain number here as necessary. Now, in the client settings, there's only one thing to note that we haven't seen before, and that is the clipboard mapping item. You see, by default, you can copy and paste information from within applications back and forth between the user's physical console and the terminal services session. That would be something like, paragraphs of text out of Microsoft Word, for example. You cannot use clipboard mapping to copy and paste, however, actual physical files. Now, if you don't want to have clipboard mapping enabled, you simply check this box to disable it. And that might be the case, for example, if you had security requirements where you didn't want someone to grab text out of one session and copy it to a file on their laptop or something else like that, and then take the laptop out of the building with confidential data on it. Now, you see that we have several settings that appear in multiple locations, so you need to know if a setting appears in multiple locations and maybe one location contradicts another, you need to be able to know which one takes priority. Well, the lowest on the totem pole is the remote desktop client. So if someone sets a setting in the remote desktop client that's conflicted by a setting in the user account, then the user account would override the remote desktop client. Likewise, in terminal services configuration, for example, in the RDP properties, if you want to configure that setting, then that could be done to override any settings in the user account, as well as any settings that appear in the remote desktop client piece. Further up the hierarchy, any settings in the user policy would override any of these bottom three settings. And then finally, a computer policy would override absolutely everything else underneath it. Now, before we go too much further here, I think I probably ought to point out that if you have an operating system that does not have remote desktop connection client software, like we have here with Windows Server 2003 and Windows XP, you can install it by going to this share, the client's share, on any Windows Server 2003 server. And the physical location is Windows System 32 Clients, then TS client, and then the Win32 folder. And from there, you can run setup.exe as an administrator to install it. Or you can just go here if you're using Windows 2000 clients and you want to install this client. Then this would allow you to install it automatically using a group policy object. Now let's also take a look at another administrator tool for terminal services, and that's located on Administrative Tools down here at Terminal Services Manager. Now I'll explain this dialog box here shortly, but once you get into this, what you want to do is to connect to a terminal server. DC Nugget 1 is my domain controller, so that's not going to work. So I'm going to go to Nugget Lab down here and double click on it, where it's going to refresh the view, where I see that I do have DC Nugget 2 as a terminal server. I have to double click on that as well in order to connect to it. So I double click on it, then it shows me who's connected. Now, we've talked a lot in the past about shadowing user sessions and being able to view the user session or remotely control the user session. So I think to myself, okay, Phoenix User 03, I've heard they're a pretty nefarious person, so I want to see what they're up to. Right click and remote control. Well, that doesn't seem to be working. How am I supposed to remote control it? It's all grayed out. Well, you see, there's a couple of issues there. Number one, the user is disconnected in the first place. So I reconnect that user offline here, and I go back to it, and I right-click on it. I still can't remote control. I can do all these other things, though, which explain themselves, by the way. Why can't I remote control? Well, the reason for that is you cannot remote control or shadow a user unless you are doing it from within your own terminal services session. So let me cancel out of this, close that out, and go back to my own terminal services session as the administrator. And from here, I'm going to go to Administrative Tools within a terminal services session of my own, and then go back down to Terminal Services Manager. Notice I didn't get that dialog box now. That's what that was talking about, is that I can't remote control a user unless I'm doing that from within my own Terminal Services session like we see right now. Now I can go to this user, right-click, and then I could choose Remote Control. So then once we press remote control there, we are encountering this dialog box which tells us we need to press a hotkey to get out of the remote control session. And the reason is, it's not like remote assistance where there's this big disconnect button up there. You'll be immersed in that user's session, and the only way to get out without doing this is simply to log off that session, and that might not be what you want. So we click OK on our end, and on the user's end, they'll have a prompt asking them if we want to control their session. And here on the user's end, we see the message. Do we want to allow them to request our remotely control our session? We'll click on yes. And you see we are now actually in that user's session. And you see, maybe what we've been doing is trying to help the user bold some words because they're in WordPad here and trying to get everybody to join the Lord of the Rings fan club. I'm sure that's a company-sponsored event. Anyway, what they're saying is, I've been highlighting the text like you told me. And then you keep telling me to hit the big B to make it bold, right? Okay, well, I hit the B on the keyboard and look what happens. Well, if that's the kind of problem that they're having, maybe you need to remotely control this user's session and point out to them, look, that's not what I'm talking about on the keyboard. I mean to select the Lord of the Rings, and then you're connected like you are right now, remote controlling the session. And then you move your mouse pointer mystically up here to the B. And you say, that's the B I was talking about, young one. Click on B, and it becomes just like that, little hobbit. Okay. And they say, oh, thank you so much, and they're all grateful to you and everything, and you'll just say, oh, you can just call me Gandalf if you like. Now all that really remains is we need to get out of this session using our secret keyboard combination of Control-Q, and we need to get out of here before we're tempted to watch Lord of the Rings for the 30th time, so we hit Control-Q and bust out. And then once we do that, it brings us back to our Terminal Services Manager interface. And you can do other things with this as well. You can go to the sessions and look at all the various connections to the terminal server. You can go to the processes. This is kind of handy because on terminal server, if my user, and I can sort this according to username, for example, Phoenix user 03 is working with WordPad, which you can kind of see over here to the right. They're working with that WordPad document. What if that's hung up the system, and it's also hanging up the terminal server? Well, I can right-click here and choose End Process, and I'm doing this really remotely from within Terminal Services Manager. So I could do it that way. Also, another quick shortcut if you want to know about it is you can right-click here, go to Task Manager, and then from within Task Manager, I see the user session. Notice that I can disconnect or log that user off as well as send them a message. And I can also remote control them from this interface as well if I don't have access for some reason or don't want to go to Terminal Services Manager. Now, that having been said, I can again go back to the processes over here, and I can again look at various processes that are running. And if I'm running a terminal server, I need to show processes from all users by selecting that checkbox, and then it will show me all my terminal services users as well. This is also, again, just another way of accessing that executable or whatever it is that's causing a problem, for example, right-clicking here, and again, choosing End Process if necessary. Another thing I'd like to point out here is just to notice that the executable RDP clip, that's our clipboard copy-paste item I was talking to you about earlier that allows you to copy and paste between sessions. And your actual console desktop. Now, I've alluded to session directory at times in the past here within this nugget. Let me explain to you what that is about and how it works. Here I've got just a normal client who's trying to establish a remote desktop connection to one of these terminal servers. Each one of these terminal servers is a node within a cluster. As such, the cluster is identified by a single name and IP address. So when this client tries to connect to this IP address, it's kind of random whichever one of these terminal services nodes is actually going to handle the connection request. Let's say that this one handles it the first time. Well, then the user has some documents they left open, some applications running, they go home for the day and come back the next morning. When they come back, it's a pretty good chance that it's going to connect to one of these other servers. Let's say it connects to this one. The user says, my mind must be playing tricks on me. I thought I left documents open and an application running. I guess not. So then they try to access the same documents they had open from yesterday, and then they get all these messages saying the file is locked, and they'll have to open it up in read-only mode and all this kind of stuff. So they say, I must have done something wrong. So then they disconnect that session. And then they connect, and it could be that, again, they connect yet a third time to a different one, a third one now. Now they have three totally different terminal services sessions going on here, and they can't get anything done because what they want is kind of orphaned out here on the original node. Now, the way this actually works then with session directory is that when this user originally established this connection, then this terminal server identifies that connection to the session directory. The session directory then will keep track of who has what connections on which terminal services within the clusters here. So tomorrow when the user comes back in and they try to reestablish a connection to this disconnected session, and instead they accidentally contact this node in the cluster, this node will say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not so sure you should be connecting to me. First, let me check with the session directory to see if you have an existing connection. And the session directory says, yeah, Phoenix user 03, yeah, they're already connected to this one, or they've got a disconnected session over here on node 1. And then this terminal server will redirect this client's request back to the original terminal server, and everybody's happy. Now, when it comes to maintaining terminal servers, you might want to be aware of a few command line utilities that can be very handy here. For example, if I've got to bring down this terminal server for maintenance, before I do that, I need to see who's using this session. I could do a couple things. I could first of all do a query user. So I just do query space user, and that gives me the identification information about who actually is logged on right now. By the way, if you just want a real quick shortcut for that, you can also just do Q user. Does the same thing. And then once I see who's connected, I can say, oh man, we can't disconnect now. The Phoenix user 03 is the vice president. He's going to get mad at me if I disconnect. Well, another thing you can do then, if you have, especially if you have several users logged on at the time, is you can also prevent new users from logging on, and that would be change, log on, and then disable. And now, I've got some people logged on right now, but at least I know I'm not going to get more people logged on and lengthen the period of time that it's going to take for me to actually be able to bring this server down. And then, of course, if you want to reverse that and allow people to log back on again, you do change log on and then / enable, obviously. Finally, then, once I'm able to shut this server down, I see that my connections have trickled down, and I've just got a few users left here, for example. I could do a ts shuts down, and if you do a / question mark, that gives you all kinds of options that are available there. I particularly like this reboot one, which will automatically reboot the server after the user sessions are terminated. That way I don't have to sit around waiting for everybody to go home, kind of like you do at the end of a New Year's Eve party when you're saying, hey, okay, it's New Year's now, everybody go home. Anyway, so what we'll do here then is to do a ts shut down. If you do it with no options, it assumes you're talking about the local terminal server. Then it gives the users 60 seconds to shut down, and you see the message right there. That gives them time to save their documents before they get kicked out. Of course, it doesn't do a timer where it counts down here, so the user may actually only have 10 seconds when they look at this, and they think they have 60. Who knows? Anyway, if you want to cancel that, then you can press Control-C, and that'll cancel your shutdown. Now then, licensing is another thing of which you should be aware, and for that you'll need to go into Control Panel and add Remove Programs to add a Windows licensing server, Terminal Services licensing server. So you go to Add Remove Windows Components, and then down here you'll have Terminal Server Licensing. You select that, and then just Next, Finish to install it. Now, before we go too much further, though, let me point out that you should install as a Terminal Server Licensing server a server that is not a terminal server itself. You want to try to separate those roles. And secondly, you want to put it in an optimal location where it's either well connected to a domain controller so that lookups are easier, or is actually on a domain controller. It's not an overwhelming role in terms of its utilization. It just has to have licenses on it and has to be able to make them available for the terminal servers to be able to read and issue them. So we can make this also available then, whichever server you decide to install this on, to your entire enterprise. That would include any domains within my entire forest, or a specific domain or work group. Now that's a no-brainer. If I have only a work group, that's my only choice. Why would I choose, however, a domain when I could choose my entire enterprise that would then encompass, of course, naturally, all of my domains? Because you'll probably do your domain anyway if you have highly separated cost centers for each individual domain, and your accounting is very diverse for each one of those, and you have different levels of accountability for them all. I'm going to choose the entire enterprise, and then you can notice the database location, and then we'll just click on Next. Then it just goes ahead and installs itself, and I'll see you on the other side of this. Now then, we need to go ahead and access Terminal Services Licensing, so we'll go to Administrative Tools and move on down here to Terminal Server Licensing. Once we get this open, we see that we can access the Terminal Services server, and if we expand its node, we see that it does have capability of tracking Windows 2000 Terminal Services client access licenses. Now, this Terminal Server Licensing server, that's a Windows Server 2003 server, is capable of 3 types of Windows 2000 license tracking. The first one is just a normal client access license for any operating system other than Windows 2000 Professional or XP, which already include licenses for Windows 2000 terminal servers. We can also use Windows 2000 Terminal Services Internet Connector licenses, which allow as many as 200 simultaneous and anonymous connections to the terminal server, as long as it's a Windows 2000 terminal server, by any non-employees from across the internet. That's kind of useful if you need to establish connections for a demonstration of a new software product that you're doing, or some kind of thing like that where you want people to be able to connect using terminal services. And then the Windows 2000 built-in licenses are for any Windows 2000 or XP computer that are issued a token that are built into their operating system, and that's Windows 2000 Professional or Windows XP. Now then, with Windows Server 2003 Terminal Services licenses, you would right-click on the name of the server here, and then you have to activate the server, at which point it's going to start a wizard that will allow us to contact Microsoft's clearinghouse for licenses. So we'll activate the server. We get an activation wizard that starts up here. We'll go ahead and next this, and then we can make an automatic connection over the internet, or we can make an automatic, or rather, connection over the internet using a web browser, or just use normal voice telephone. Now, we'll just use the automatic connection because I'm lazy, and that's the easiest method. Then we'll just go ahead and click on Next here, and it's going to contact one of the Microsoft servers. Then we have to enter in required information here. So we'll just kind of fill in some information there, and you just fill that in. That is information that you do have to have. That's not optional. And then this would be an optional material. You don't have to enter in anything here. I'll just go ahead and next this. And then it tries to contact the Microsoft activation server. And then once it does that, I can start the terminal server client licensing wizard, which is yet another wizard, of course. Then we'll click on Next here. And then we're going to try to actually access a series of licenses from this. And you have to choose which kind of license program you are within. For our case, we could do a licensed retail purchase, or you could do any one of these others, and you'll just have to check with your organization to determine what kind of license agreement you want. For our purposes, I'll just next through the license pack for the retail purchase, and then you just click on Next. And at this point, you simply enter in a license code, which will Microsoft will have provided for you after you've agreed to purchase the licenses. And then, once you've entered that in and clicked on Add, then you'll be able to next and be able to obtain the licenses necessary. Now, I mentioned a little while ago what kind of Windows 2000 client access licenses you can use. For Windows Server 2003 licenses, you have three different types. You have Windows Server 2003 Terminal Server Device CALs, or client access licenses. And that means that every device that connects to the terminal server would require a license. Alternatively, you can choose to use user CALs, and these are in a per-user mode, so each user that connects requires a license. And then finally, these are not actually available yet at the time of this recording, but they may become available soon. There are also Windows Server 2003 Terminal Server External Connector licenses. And these allow unlimited connection to a terminal server running Windows Server 2003, and external users can connect to them with this license. Now also, once you have activated the server, you don't have to immediately make sure that you have all the licenses available there. You actually have a 90-day grace period from the time you activate the server to actually get the licenses that you need. Also, I mentioned earlier that you can install this as an enterprise or as a domain workgroup licensed server. There is something else that you have to understand about that. An enterprise licensed server will only be discoverable by terminal services that are also within the same site, Active Directory site, as the licensing server. If you've got a workgroup or domain licensed server, then it's going to be discoverable only by terminal servers that are also in that same domain or workgroup. However, they can cross site boundaries. Now, your terminal servers will poll the network periodically to try to find a licensed server. Once they find one, they kind of latch onto it and remember where it is, and then when a user tries to establish a terminal services connection to that terminal server, the terminal server says, hey, I remember where my license server is. Then it contacts that license server on the user's behalf, retrieves the license, passes it back down to the client. The client now has the license. Actually, the first license that's installed there on the client side is just a temporary license, and the permanent license is only assigned at the second connection. Also, it's called a permanent license at that second connection, but it's kind of interesting too, because they're set to expire randomly anytime between 52 and 89 days. And the purpose for that is so that if that user doesn't reconnect within whatever their expiration period is there, that license can be recycled and used for somebody else and kind of be more efficient for us that way. In this nugget, we took a look at terminal services, and this was part 2. We continued our discussion of terminal services configuration with pieces such as the Terminal Services Management Console. And then we looked at options priority, because a lot of the options you'll see there appear in multiple locations. You need to know which ones take precedence if there are any in conflict. We also looked at how to install the client piece from the client's configured share on the server. Then we saw there are a couple of different ways to install that client for Windows. Then we looked at remote control, and this is necessary if you want to be able to look at a user's session or totally control the user's session. And this can be done through your own terminal services session. We looked at command line utilities, which are useful for helping to prevent new connections if you need to bring a server down for maintenance, so that you don't want any new connections to it. And then we also looked at command line utilities to kick users off and give them a little notification as well. We looked at session directory. This is very useful in a clustering scenario when you want to make sure that disconnected users reconnect to the same terminal services cluster node as the one they originally had in the first place. And then we looked at licensing and terminal services licensing and how to configure that. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.